Space exploration, the final frontier. Humans have always had a knack for exploring new lands, and unfortunately, we've already discovered every chunk here on Earth. Well, except for the ocean. But the ocean isn't nearly as cool as space. But the question is, where are we at on the space exploration timeline? What were the biggest hurdles that we have already overcome? What was the first rocket, the first spacewalk, the first space rendezvous docking, the very first high-def colored image of another planet's surface? How did we go from this to this? We will discuss all the major milestones in today's video on the evolution of space exploration. Let's get into it. Guys, we gotta start off way back in the day with some space exploration prehistory. Starting with the very first proto-rockets. It is believed that the Chinese invented the first rockets in the 13th century. These weren't technically true rockets, but they were, projectiles launched with the use of gunpowder. These were often called fire arrows, almost like arrow cannons. Different implementations of this technique continued for several centuries, and it wasn't until the 20th century that things really began to take off. Get it? Take off? The idea of space exploration was pretty popular at the beginning of the 1900s. Who could forget the classic sci-fi French adventure film, A Trip to the Moon, released in 1902? Check out that rocket. That low-key looks kind of like the command module from the Apollo missions. Doesn't it? Just a little bit? This movie, and others like it, inspired great minds to really learn about the practicalities of space travel. Perhaps the most famous of these great minds was German scientist Hermann Oberth, who in 1923 authored the book Ways to Space Travel. This book really became the foundation of rocketry. While the book was mostly just speculation, it did include detailed diagrams of two-stage rocket designs. If you want to get into space, you really do need like a multi-stage rocket design. So this guy was kind of ahead of his time. In fact, many to this day consider him the father of space exploration. Meanwhile, in the United States, specifically Massachusetts, a man by the name of Robert Goddard launched what may be the first liquid-fueled rocket on March 16, 1926. The foundations of rocketry were in place, and there was a new country in Europe. Yes, that specific German country. Which I would say, but I feel like I might get demonetized, so I'm not going to say it. Anyway, war was on the horizon, and rockets were seen as a promising piece of war technology. So this specific German country had the German word I can't pronounce, Army Research Center, research the use of rockets as ballistic missiles. The man in charge of the research center was none other than Wernher von Braun. Yes, the Wernher von Braun, perhaps the most important figure in space exploration history. Also Homer Hickman's hero in October Skies. Von Braun and the Research Center developed several rocket designs known as the Aggregate series. Most of them were pretty bad, but one design in particular stood out from the rest. The Aggregate 4, aka the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket is perhaps the most important rocket of all time. The V2 rocket to rockets is like the Ford Model T to cars. Technically it wasn't the first rocket, but it was the first mainstream, mass-produced, somewhat reliable rocket. It was designed in 1942, and its primary use was as a ballistic missile aimed towards Allied forces. However, not every rocket was used during the war. In fact, one was actually launched into space. On June 20th, 1944, the V2 rocket MW18014 became the very first man-made object to reach space. It traveled to an altitude of 176 kilometers or 109 miles. Anything above the Kármán line or 100 kilometers is considered space. So this rocket easily crossed into space, making it the very first suborbital space launch. Humans had finally entered the space age. So yeah, World War II ended, and there was this thing called Operation Paperclip, where Americans tried to capture as many German scientists as possible. They were captured and then sent back to the US to places like New Mexico and Alabama. We also found many of the factories that produced the V2 rockets, and we took all the diagrams, all the schematics, all the parts and pieces, and shipped them to the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Of course, we weren't the only country to do this. The Soviet Union was also capturing a ton of German scientists, and they also formed their own rocket research facilities. Towards the end of 1945, the US began building V2 rockets from spare parts and started testing them out for scientific purposes. This led to a new space exploration milestone, the first photo of Earth from space captured on October 24th, 1946. Beautiful photo. A few months later, the very first animal, or animals I should say, entered space when the US launched a V-2 rocket with fruit flies in it on February 20th, 1947. This was to check out radiation levels and their effect on the flies. The flies did not survive. 2 years later, on June 14th, 1949, the very first mammal entered space when the US launched a V-2 rocket with a monkey by the name of Albert, specifically Albert II. Albert I did not make it. But Albert II did, and he reached an altitude of 83 miles, or 132 kilometers. Unfortunately, his parachute failed to deploy, and Albert died on impact. He was alive, though, in space, so technically he was the first mammal and first monkey in space. Very cool. In 1949, we finally have a new rocket, the Aerobee sounding rocket. This new rocket was heavily inspired by the German V-2 rocket, but there were several improvements, making it way more reliable and cost-effective. The Soviet Union also developed a new rocket in 1949, known as the R-2. Something else happened in 1949. The Soviet Union tested its very first nuclear weapon, thus starting the Cold War. Do you know what's better than sending a fleet of bombers equipped with nuclear weapons? Sending a fleet of ballistic missiles equipped with nuclear weapons. Both countries recognized this and quickly began developing ICBMs. One example being the new Viking rocket in the US. Space exploration was on hold. While space exploration would take a backseat for the next few years, there were still several firsts. On July 24th, 1950, the very first rocket launch at Cape Canaveral occurred when the US launched a modified V-2 rocket. Another major milestone occurred a year later with the very first animals to survive a trip into space. The Soviet dogs Dezik and Tsygan completed a suborbital spaceflight on July 22, 1951. The trip lasted 14 minutes, with the dogs reaching an altitude of 110 kilometers or 68 miles. About a year later, the very last V-2 rocket would be launched on September 19, 1952. It only reached 7 kilometers before exploding. From 1952 to 1956, there's pretty much a bunch of Cold War stuff, a bunch of ballistic missile rocket development. Not much in space exploration, but major advances in rocketry. However, in 1957, everything would change. The very first satellite, Sputnik 1, was launched by the Soviet Union on October 4th. Not only was this the first satellite, but since it was a satellite, it was also the very first orbital space launch. This is a big deal. Every launch up to this point had just been a little suborbital, a little launch that just came back down. Maybe they'd reach about 200 kilometers in altitude, but they always came back down like 20 minutes later. But this launch literally went to an altitude of 1,000 kilometers or just over 500 miles. Huge achievement. They were able to do this by launching the satellite on a modified R-7 ICBM rocket. The R-7 rocket design is one of the most important, the most significant rocket designs of all time. In fact, the Soyuz rocket, still in use to this day by the Russians, has its roots in the R-7 ICBM. I mean, look at the base. They look very similar. Less than a month later, the Soviet Union had another first, the first animal to orbit the Earth. This was, of course, the famous Soviet dog Laika. People still love Laika to this day. Unfortunately, Laika died of hypothermia during the fourth orbit of the trip. This was to be expected as there was no known technique to successfully re-enter the atmosphere without burning up at this time. By the end of 1957, the US is not pleased. They hated the idea that the Soviet Union was ahead in their development of rocket technology. The US's first attempt to get even with the Soviets was with the newly developed Vanguard rocket. This was a 3-stage rocket that in theory could launch US satellites into orbit. Unfortunately, the first attempted launch on December 6, 1957 only reached an altitude of 4 feet. Eager to match with the Soviets, the US quickly threw together a few ballistic missiles, creating the 4-stage Juno 1 rocket, which successfully launched the very first US satellite, Explorer 1, on February 1, 1958. A major success as this satellite reached an orbit of 2,550 kilometers or 1,580 miles, way beyond Sputnik 1. In fact, this satellite didn't decay until 1970. A few months later, on March 17, 1958, the first successful Vanguard rocket was launched carrying the 4th satellite, the Vanguard 1. This was the first solar-powered satellite and the oldest satellite still in orbit to this day. That's pretty crazy. It had an impressive apogee of 4,000 kilometers or 2,466 miles. It's estimated that this satellite will decay around 2,200. Later that year, on October 11, 1958, the US launched Pioneer 1 on a Thor-able rocket, with the crazy goal of entering an orbit around the moon. Technically, it was a failure as it crashed back to Earth a few days later, but it had a crazy apogee of 113,300 kilometers, or 70,000 miles. We were easily into space by this point, and it looked pretty dang cool. On December 18th, 1958, the first communication satellite was launched by the US, known as SCORE. This communication satellite had a Christmas message from President Eisenhower. Here's the message that could be picked up across the globe via radio.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
Pretty cool. It was also launched on an early Atlas rocket, a family of rockets that is still in use to this day. So 1958 was a pretty big year for the US. They seemed to be catching ground on the Soviets. However, unfortunately for the US, the next year, 1959, would be another big year for the Soviets, starting with the January 2nd Luna 1 launch from the USSR. The goal was to impact the moon. However, they missed. But it was still a huge first for space exploration, as it was the very first man-made object to reach escape velocity and enter into a heliocentric orbit, aka an orbit around the sun. That's a huge achievement. I mean, that's crazy. To me, that's just as big as Sputnik. Obviously, it's still in orbit to this day, somewhere between Earth and Mars. The US was never too far behind though, and a few months later, on March 3rd, 1959, the US launched Pioneer 4, the first US spacecraft to achieve escape velocity and a heliocentric orbit. A couple of other milestones from that year include the very first astronaut class, the Mercury 7, announced on April 9th, 1959, as well as the first man-made object to hit another celestial object. That was the Luna 2 lunar impactor, which hit the moon on September 12, 1959. A few days later, the Soviet Luna 3 flew by the moon and captured the very first image of the far side of the moon. Here is said image, and here it is compared with a modern photo. The Luna 3 spacecraft was the very first spacecraft to use a gravity assist, something that would become very important in the future of space exploration. 1960 had several space travel highlights, including the very first retrieval of a rocket and the very first restart of a second stage. But the main highlight easily goes to the first animals to survive an orbital space flight, the Soviet dogs Belka and Strelka, who spent 25 hours in space on August 19, 1960. There were also 40 mice, 2 rats, and a variety of plants on board. While Laika gets a lot of attention for being the first dog to orbit the Earth, these animals were the first to orbit Earth and survive. Also, they were taxidermized after the event, so if you want to see them, you can still see them to this day. Moving on to 1961, another huge year for space exploration and the Soviets, starting with the February 12th launch of Venera 1. While a failure, Venera 1 was the very first spacecraft to fly past another planet as it flew past Venus. Very cool, but these achievements would quickly be overshadowed by a mega first. The first human in space, and the first human to survive spaceflight, and the first human to orbit the Earth. This was Russian Yuri Gagarin on Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961. He orbited the Earth several times and returned as a Soviet hero. So later that year, on May 5th, Alan Shepard became the very first American in space as part of Project Mercury. Technically, this was a first. This was the very first suborbital human spaceflight. But it's less of an achievement than the orbital spaceflight accomplished by the Soviets and Yuri Gagarin. At the end of 1961, on December 12th, there was a rather surprising first. The first amateur private satellite known as Project Oscar, which was launched on a Thor Agena US rocket. Oscar stood for Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio 1. It decayed after a few months. Mars finally makes its first appearance in today's video with the Mariner 2, which on December 14, 1962, achieved the very first successful flyby of another planet. Now, I did mention Venera 1 earlier when the Soviets did the flyby of Venus. However, that spacecraft was not a success. No data had been transferred. The Mariner 2, however, was successful and was able to relay its data back to Earth. June 16, 1963 saw the very first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, who was on Vostok 6, another first for the Soviets. She's the only woman to complete a solo mission in space ever, like even to this day. The very first American woman in space was Sally Ride in 1983. The final event of this chapter is the first satellite to achieve a geosynchronous orbit, with SYNCOM-2 launched on July 26, 1963. This means that it orbits with the Earth's rotation. Like, it goes, so it's always in the same point in the sky. It might move a little bit, but it's in the same point. This is very useful for things like satellite TV, for instance. But now we move on to the next era, the next chapter. At this point, we have achieved suborbital spaceflight. We have achieved orbital spaceflight. But by the mid-1960s, things really began to take off for space exploration, beginning with January 29, 1964, which saw the initial phases of the Apollo program with the very first successful Block 2 Saturn rocket launch. We also saw the first launch of the Gemini program occurring just a few months later on April 8th. The Gemini program was like the beta Apollo program. So the Apollo program, in case you are unfamiliar, was the program that was meant to get a man on the moon. The Gemini program was meant to test and achieve various space-related maneuvers like rendezvous and docking and things like that, so that we could get to the moon. It was kind of like a precursor to the Apollo program. On July 28, 1964, we launched Ranger 7, a lunar impactor, and the first spacecraft to send up-close high-quality images of another solar system body. Look at these images. Very high quality. Now, while the Soviets had been ahead in the space race, their images have been absolutely terrible. This is some high quality stuff right here. Speaking of the Soviets, they achieved the very first crewed space launch on October 12th with the Voskhod 1. This is the very first spacecraft to carry more than one person. This year kind of belongs to the US though, as on November 28th, Mariner 4 was the very first spacecraft to image another planet with some high quality photos. Specifically the first up-close images of Mars, including the famous hand-drawn image. Some photos are unclear, but some are actually pretty decent, like you can clearly see some Martian craters. While successful, it killed the idea of intelligent life on Mars, and it proved that Mars had a pretty thin atmosphere. On March 3rd, 1965, we have the first crewed US spaceflight and the first crewed Gemini mission, Gemini 3, featuring the late Gus Grissom and John Young. Let me talk real quick about John Young. This dude is like the most accomplished astronaut ever. He was on Gemini. He walked on the moon. He was a part of 2 space shuttle missions. This guy's like the spaceman, man. Only a week later, the Soviets would achieve yet another major space milestone. On March 18th, 1965, Alexei Leonov on Voskhod 2 achieved the very first EVA, aka the very first spacewalk, which lasted 12 minutes. After the spacewalk, he had issues getting back into the spacecraft because the spacesuit had expanded super big and they were like slowly trying to bring him in and they were slowly depressurizing it. A scary situation. On November 16th, 1965, Venera 3 from the Soviet Union was the first human object to reach the surface of another planet, Venus. However, it was not successful and it did not return any data. So when it comes to space exploration, this next achievement is pretty big, and it's the very first rendezvous with another spacecraft. This occurred on December 4th, 1965 with Gemini 7. The crew of Gemini 7 were able to rendezvous, aka meet up, with the target spacecraft Gemini 6A. They were able to come within a foot of the spacecraft, which is insane. Now, they didn't dock, that would come later, but I mean, come on. I still have no idea how they achieve this kind of thing. Like, this kind of math is crazy. I don't know how you figure that out. Anyway, Gemini 7 also played music in space for the first time on December 16th, and here's a sample of that. Moving on to the first soft landing on another celestial body, with Luna 9 from the Soviet Union landing on the moon on January 31st, 1966. Luna 9 also took the very first surface image of another celestial body. This image right here. Terrible quality though, I can barely see what's going on. On March 16th, there was another major milestone within the Gemini program. Gemini 8 had the very first docking with another spacecraft, specifically the Agena target vehicle. Guess who was there? Neil Armstrong. Unfortunately, there was some issues while they were docked. The spacecraft began to slowly spin. Armstrong thought that maybe it was the Agena spacecraft, so he undocked, but then they started to spin a lot. Here's footage of said spin. Somehow Armstrong was a genius in the situation, and he fired some boosters and resolved it. Pretty scary, but pretty impressive. The whole ordeal lasted 30 minutes, and Armstrong never panicked, and he fixed the situation, and the heads at NASA were pretty impressed. On May 30th, 1966, the Surveyor 1 was the first American soft lander on the moon. The Soviets had already done this, but Surveyor 1 did achieve the first high-quality images of the surface of another celestial body. On July 18th, Gemini 10 completed the very first EVA to another spacecraft. Gemini 10 also was the very first to connect with the Aegis controls and boost itself into a more elliptical orbit. By the way, some of these Gemini photos are incredible. Like, look at that quality for the 60s. That's amazing. Speaking of good quality images, on August 10th, we had the very first lunar orbiter with Lunar Orbiter 1. The Lunar Orbiter 1 achieved the very first image of Earth from the moon. Things seem to be heading in the right direction for space exploration. Major achievements had been accomplished up to this point. However, unfortunately, 1967 saw a major setback with the Apollo 1 disaster when a fire claimed the lives of 3 astronauts on January 27th. Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. This was supposed to be a major event. They were going to spend 14 days in orbit around Earth inside the newly developed Apollo Command and Service Module. But unfortunately, this would not be the case, and the Apollo program and the US space program in general would see some major delays. The Soviets did see some success in 1967 though, with the October 18th Venera 4 space probe. This was the very first Venus probe to measure another planet's atmosphere. The probe discovered that Venus was hot and had a thick atmosphere, and it wasn't an ideal planet for space exploration. Now, even though there were major setbacks for the US in 1967, they did achieve the very first Saturn V launch on November 9th. It was uncrewed, but this was the very first massive, super heavy lift rocket launch ever. In fact, it remained the largest rocket ever built for a super long time. Here's a comparison of the Saturn V with the V2 rocket. Yeah, here's the Space Shuttle compared to the Saturn V. Absolutely massive. But you need a massive rocket to get to the moon. The USSR made a big accomplishment by taking a tortoise and a bunch of fruit flies around the moon on September 14th. This was all part of the mission Zond 5. Later in that year, on December 24th, on Christmas Eve, we had the very first humans to fly around the moon on Apollo 8. These humans were Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. And William Anders took this extremely famous Earthrise photo, perhaps one of the most iconic photos of all time. These were also the first humans to see the far side of the moon. Finally, we have made it to 1969, probably the most famous and successful year in space exploration history to this date. Of course, the big event of 1969 is the first human to ever walk on the moon on another surface that's not Earth, and that is, of course, Neil Armstrong on July 20th, a part of Apollo 11, and then Buzz Aldrin shortly after. But we can't forget about Michael Collins up in the command module. That guy, he was doing work too. In some ways, this event is the peak of space exploration to this day. It's estimated that it took the effort of over 500,000 people to make this happen. A giant leap for mankind indeed. But now we move on to Chapter 5, the rise of planetary exploration. After Apollo 17, the last of the lunar landings, humans haven't ventured out past Earth's orbit. But there were still several advances in planetary probes. Of course, we are all fans of Martian rovers, but it actually all began in 1970 with the USSR and Luna 17 and the Lunokhod 1. Luna 17 featured the very first moving robot on another celestial body. Not as cool as an actual human person on the moon, but this is the next best thing. The Soviets had another success in 1970 with the first soft landing on another planet on December 15th. Specifically, Venera 7 successfully landing on Venus and staying alive for a total of 23 minutes. Venus is a harsh place, so 23 minutes is pretty good. Unfortunately, 1971 was a difficult year for space exploration, yet again, as it featured the first deaths in space. Earlier that year, the very first space station, Salyut 1, was launched into orbit by the Soviet Union. Soyuz 11 successfully docked with the station on June 7th and stayed there doing various experiments for 22 days. On June 29th, they re-entered the Soyuz spacecraft to return back to Earth. However, disaster struck when the work compartment jettisoned from the Soyuz. During the jettison, there was a leak in the cabin, leading to all 3 cosmonauts dying of asphyxiation. These 3 cosmonauts remain the only humans to have ever died in space. 1973 saw the final Saturn V launch. Kind of a sad event to me, honestly. But this was the launch of the first US space station, Skylab. Also in 1973, on December 2nd, Pioneer 10 was the first probe to visit and image Jupiter up close. Very cool. And this event really marks the beginning of the exploration of the gas giants. On October 22nd, 1975, the Venera 9 orbiter became the first probe to orbit Venus. The Venera 9 lander also sent the very first images of another planet's surface. Check out these rocks. These rocks are on another planet. How crazy! The big event for 1976 was the Viking 1 mission that featured both a Martian orbiter and a Martian lander. The Viking lander took the very first photo of the surface of Mars, and also the first panoramic photo of another planet, and the first colored photo of another planet, and the first high-quality photos of another planet. It was active for over 2,000 days. The orbiter also took the very first high-quality photo of another moon. 1977 was a big year for space exploration because we had the launch of the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 space probes. These space probes are huge when it comes to the first high-quality images of all the gas giants. Some that haven't even been matched to this day, specifically the 1986 Voyage 2 encounter with Uranus and the 1989 encounter with Neptune. To this day, these remain the highest quality images of the outer gas giants. But going back to human exploration, on April 12, 1981, the very first reusable spacecraft was launched, the Space Shuttle Columbia. Reusability is super important when it comes to space exploration, and it all began with the Space Shuttle in the 1980s. Of course, the rockets that launched the Space Shuttle were not reusable. Those would come later. The Space Shuttle played a huge role in the first and only International Space Station, still in orbit and in use to this day. The beginnings of the International Space Station started on November 20th, 1998 with the launch of Zarya. This right here is the very first piece of the space station. It was actually launched by the Russians. The US launched the second compartment of the space station, Unity, in the same year on December 4th, and they've been adding to it ever since. The Huygens spacecraft is the only spacecraft to land on another planet's moon, and still holds the record as the furthest landing from Earth a spacecraft has ever made. A big first, a huge first that we must talk about, is the very first successful launch of a rocket into orbit by a private company. Only countries have participated in space exploration, but that would all change when SpaceX successfully launched a rocket into orbit on September 28, 2008 with Falcon 1 Flight 4. I believe that this event will become one of the most significant milestones for space exploration. The first human-built object to ever reach interstellar space was the Voyager 1 space probe on August 26, 2012. This is a pretty crazy achievement. I mean, we went from barely skimming the Kármán line to sending probes outside of the heliosphere of the sun. I mean, that's crazy. Another huge success from SpaceX was the very first successful launch and recovery of a reusable rocket on December 22nd, my birthday by the way, 2015. This was Falcon 9 Flight 20. The first private company to send humans into orbit was Crew Dragon Demo 2 on May 30th, 2020. Of course, who can forget one of my favorites, New Horizons, the only space probe to ever image Pluto, which it did on July 14th, 2015. It also captured the furthest clear image of another celestial body, the binary asteroid Ultima Thule, in 2019. On February 6, 2018, SpaceX launched the first reusable heavy lift launch vehicle and achieved the very first heliocentric orbit by a private company. That's when they launched the car. Remember the Spaceman car? A classic space exploration event. Let's talk a little bit about Blue Origin, another private space company. On July 20th, 2021 with NS-16, Blue Origin became the very first company to launch a suborbital flight with civilian passengers. And of course, the tallest, most powerful, and most massive rocket to ever launch was SpaceX's Starship, which took its first flight on April 20th, 2023. It's also fully reusable. So this rocket is going to be huge for the future of space exploration. And this is where we're kind of at today. Things are actually looking pretty bright for the future of space exploration. We'll have to see what happens in the years ahead. I'm thinking by 2030 we could have maybe humans on Mars. I don't know. Maybe 2032. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. What events did I miss? Because I'm sure I missed I just realized I forgot to put in the very first space telescope. What major milestones did I miss that you would have added? Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.